The mud was wrong. That is what the platoon commander with the call sign Berkut noticed first on the morning of November 9, 2022. Not the sound of the Russian assault beginning 2 kilometers east, not the distant pop of illumination rounds over the tree line, but the mud. The overnight rain had turned the forest floor into something close to liquid, and the trail his scouts had flagged as a primary Russian approach route was now a channel of standing black water knee-deep in places. He looked at his map overlay, then at the swamp in front of him, and made the adjustment every good infantry commander makes when terrain does something unexpected. He moved the ambush line 40 meters north, repositioned 2 PKM teams to the base of a birch ridge, and called his mortar section with revised reference points. He did not know it at the time, but that 40-meter adjustment was about to cost a Russian mechanized company very dearly. Over the next 37 minutes, the 80th Separate Air Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces would demonstrate something the Russian command in the Lyman-Kreminna sector had been learning the hard way for months. Inside the Serebryanske forestry tract, terrain was not background. It was a weapon, and the 80th had learned to aim it. This is the story of how one Ukrainian brigade turned a dense, swampy forest into a defensive system that stalled, bled, and humiliated a Russian force that outnumbered them, outweighed them in armor, and had declared the woodland cleared on at least 4 separate occasions. Through geolocated combat footage, open-source positional data, and tree-line by tree-line mapping of the contested area, we are going to reconstruct the doctrine, the terrain, and the method. No magic weapons, no dramatic turning point, just infantry, geography, and the painstaking work of converting natural obstacles into an engineered killing ground. Stay with this for the next 34 minutes. Because what the 80th did in Serebryanske is not just a story about one forest in eastern Ukraine. It is a case study in what modern defensive warfare actually looks like when a smaller, lighter force refuses to let a larger one fight the battle it trained for. The Lyman-Kreminna axis sits in the northern reaches of Donetsk Oblast, straddling the administrative boundary with Luhansk Oblast. The town of Lyman fell to Russian forces in late May 2022 and was liberated by Ukrainian forces on October 1st of that same year in a rapid encirclement operation that trapped and largely destroyed multiple Russian battalion tactical groups. That liberation did not end the fighting in the broader sector. The Russian military regrouped east of the Serebryanske River Valley, anchored new defensive lines along the ridgelines and forest belts approaching Kreminna, and converted the Serebryanske forestry tract into a contested zone that would remain violently active for the better part of 2 years. The Serebryanske forest is not the kind of woodland that appears on tourist maps. It is industrial-grade forestry terrain, dense stands of pine and mixed deciduous growth, cut through with logging tracks that turn to swamp after rain, scattered with drainage ditches that provide excellent cover for infantry and excellent obstacles for vehicles, and broken by irregular clearings and old fire breaks that create natural fields of fire for anyone patient enough to map them. Satellite imagery from Maxar and Planet Labs available through open-source channels shows the canopy as nearly continuous across the contested zone, with gaps appearing only along the main east-west tracks and the river tributaries that bisect the area. For Russian armored and mechanized forces, this terrain is close to a nightmare. The T-80 and T-72 variants that make up the bulk of Russian ground assault capability in this sector are built for maneuver warfare on open steppe, the kind of fighting for which the Russian military has centuries of doctrine. Put them in dense forest with soft ground, and their advantages evaporate. Thermal optics are defeated by tree cover. Direct fire systems cannot engage targets beyond the next tree line. Command and control degrades as radio propagation fails through dense canopy. And infantry, forced to dismount and advance on foot, is channeled into the exact approaches that a defender with detailed local knowledge has already prepared. The 80th Separate Air Assault Brigade entered this sector with a clear understanding of those dynamics. Formed as part of Ukraine's airmobile forces and trained in rapid deployment and high-intensity infantry tactics, the brigade had operational experience that predated the full-scale invasion. By the time they were operating in the Serebryanske sector, they had developed what Ukrainian military analysts and open-source researchers began calling a layered ambush belt system. Not a single defensive line, but a series of interlocking strongpoints, each designed to channel Russian forces into pre-registered fire zones. Here is where the geography and the doctrine intersect in a way that determined everything else. And here is the part that does not appear in most coverage of this sector. Russia believed, based on doctrinal assumptions baked into its operational planning, that the forest belt could be cleared using standard combined arms procedure. Suppress with artillery, push infantry through to establish a foothold, follow with armored vehicles on the logging tracks, consolidate. The problem was that this procedure assumes a defender who holds a continuous line and breaks under sufficient pressure. The 80th was not holding a continuous line. They were holding a constellation of mutually supporting positions, each one individually weak, collectively lethal, and specifically designed to punish the kind of probing assault that Russian forces defaulted to when they lacked sufficient combined arms coordination. What the Russian command repeatedly described as cleared woodland was, in operational reality, territory where their patrol had advanced 400 meters without contact, declared the area held, and then been hit from 3 directions during the withdrawal. By early 2023, open-source researchers tracking geolocated combat footage from the Serebryanske sector had identified a consistent pattern. Ukrainian positions were not on treeline edges, the obvious, easiest-to-target ground. They were set back from the tree line by 30 to 80 meters, in positions that forced any attacker to enter the forest before making visual contact with the defender. The approaches to these positions were mined. Not mined in a blanket pattern, but mined selectively on the routes that infantry, moving carefully through thick cover and soft ground, would instinctively choose. The dry ridges, the game trails, the edges of drainage ditches where the ground was firm enough to walk without sinking. One detail that stuck with me when reviewing the available footage and mapping data: the Ukrainians were not just placing mines on approaches, they were placing them on the withdrawal routes from those approaches. The intent was not to stop the first wave, it was to catch the second wave coming in to recover the first. This is the kind of thinking that wins forest battles, and it is not improvised. It is doctrine. The 80th's approach drew on a combination of inherited Soviet-era forest warfare training, which the Ukrainian military retained and adapted after 1991, and lessons learned from the first year of full-scale fighting. Soviet doctrine for forest defense, laid out in field manuals that both Ukrainian and Russian officers studied, emphasizes exactly this kind of depth and ambush approach. But the Soviet manuals were written for large formations defending large forest belts against large-scale assault. What the 80th had done was scale the doctrine down to the reality of 2023 Eastern Ukraine. Company-level and platoon-level execution, dispersed small unit positions, and an emphasis on information, knowing exactly where the enemy was before engaging, that the full-scale war had made central to Ukrainian tactical thinking. Consider for a moment what Russia had in this sector, and what Ukraine had, and why the difference determined the outcome. Russia had numerical superiority in infantry, particularly after the partial mobilization of September 2022 added hundreds of thousands of conscripts to the order of battle. It had armored vehicles, artillery tubes, and air support capability, though the last was significantly constrained by Ukrainian air defenses, making close air support missions extremely costly. What Russia did not have in the Serebryanske sector was the terrain knowledge, the prepared positions, or the tactical flexibility to fight a forest ambush battle effectively. Its mobilized infantry, funneled into the sector to replace the professional formations destroyed in the 2022 offensives, had weeks of training rather than years. Their small unit leaders lacked the experience to navigate forest terrain under contact, maintain tactical spacing, and identify ambush signatures before walking into them. Ukraine had fewer bodies in the fight, lighter equipment that was actually suited to forest terrain, mortars, anti-tank guided missiles, drone reconnaissance assets, and months of continuous position improvement in the specific ground they were defending. The brigade's assault companies had rotated through the sector long enough to know every drainage ditch, every reliable firing position, every piece of ground that flooded at what depth of rain. That knowledge was not in any database. It was in the heads of the section leaders who had been walking that ground since autumn. By the spring of 2023, the pattern of fighting in the Serebryanske sector had developed a rhythm that open-source researchers could track almost in real time through geolocated footage posted to Telegram channels associated with both Russian milbloggers and Ukrainian units. The rhythm went like this. Russian forces would accumulate along the eastern edge of the forest tract, supported by artillery preparation on identified or suspected Ukrainian positions. They would push infantry into the trees. The Ukrainian defenders, drawing on pre-positioned observation posts and drone reconnaissance assets, would let the lead element penetrate to a predetermined depth, then activate the kill zone. Mortar teams, working from grid references established weeks or months earlier, would drop rounds on the withdrawal route. PKM positions on the flanks would engage the lead element from angles that prevented effective return fire. The overall position would absorb the assault, bleed it, and remain in Ukrainian hands when it was over. Then it would happen again, 48 hours later or a week later, in a slightly different part of the forest. The Russian military had a word for this cycle in its internal communications, at least according to intercepted and leaked communications reviewed by open-source analysts. The word translated roughly as meat grinder, applied not to the Ukrainian strategy, but to the experience of the Russian units fed into the sector. Multiple Russian milblog posts from the period described the Serebryanske front as among the most difficult fighting in the entire Lyman-Kreminna axis, with one post, since archived and analyzed by the conflict intelligence team, describing a 72-hour period in which a Russian assault group had attempted the same axis of approach 4 times, losing personnel each time, and had never achieved visual contact with the Ukrainian position that was engaging them. Think about what that means from a tactical perspective. You are taking casualties from a position you cannot locate, on ground you cannot navigate effectively, with artillery support that cannot engage targets, it cannot see through forest canopy. The rational response is to pull back and call for more preparation fires. But the Russian operational culture in this sector, driven by orders from above demanding forward movement, frequently pushed units back into the kill zone before they had identified what had hit them. Here is the take that is probably going to generate some pushback. This was not primarily a story about Ukrainian heroism, though there was plenty of that. It was a story about Russian operational dysfunction. A competent combined arms force with proper reconnaissance, with patient methodical forest clearance using dismounted infantry and indirect fire coordination, with the willingness to slow down and map the kill zones before advancing, could have ground through the Serebryanske sector eventually. The Russian forces in this sector did not do that consistently. They repeated approaches that had failed. They sent in assault groups without adequate reconnaissance preparation. And they did so in part because the command culture demanded visible progress over sustainable method. The 80th's job was to make each of those attempts as costly as possible. They were spectacularly good at it. The mortar coordination that the brigade's defender companies developed in this sector is worth examining in some detail because it represents one of the more sophisticated applications of organic indirect fire in the entire conflict. Ukrainian military doctrine, adapted from Soviet precedent and updated through 2014-2022 experience in the Donbass, places significant emphasis on pre-registered mortar fires, the practice of establishing precise grid coordinates for anticipated enemy positions or movement corridors, and storing those coordinates for rapid engagement when needed. In the forest, this practice became essential. The tree canopy that defeated Russian direct-fire optics also defeated drone observation for targeting purposes in certain conditions. But a pre-registered mortar grid does not need real-time observation. When the pattern of Russian approach routes becomes predictable, and in the Serebryanske sector, constrained by terrain, it did become predictable, the mortar section can engage with high confidence using time-on-target techniques without needing a forward observer to adjust fires in real time. The round lands on the grid. If the Russian infantry is on that grid, the result is predictable. Open-source footage from the sector, reviewed by multiple independent analysts, shows mortar engagement patterns consistent with this approach. Impacts land precisely on logging track intersections, on the edges of clearings that channeled infantry movement, on the tree lines where Russian forces habitually paused before crossing open ground. The dispersion patterns visible in drone footage are tight, consistent with pre-registered fires rather than hasty adjustment, and the response times between visible Russian movement and the first impacts are short enough to suggest the fires were triggered by observation of known indicators, not by the time-consuming process of calling for and adjusting a new fire mission. This is competence under pressure. It is also preparation. Months of it, built into the position while the fighting elsewhere created the time to do the work. Somewhere around the midpoint of the brigade's extended defense of this sector, the character of the Russian effort began to shift. The assault groups that had been fed piecemeal into the tree line were replaced at intervals by more coordinated attempts that combined artillery preparation with engineer assets. Specifically, attempts to use armored engineer vehicles to improve logging tracks to a condition that would support armored vehicle movement. Satellite imagery from the period, reviewed through open-source channels, shows work on at least 3 approach routes in the eastern portion of the forest tract, with cleared ground and improved track surfaces visible in progressive imagery. The Ukrainian response to these engineering efforts is instructive. Rather than attempting to interdict the work itself, which would have required engaging at distances and in conditions that increased Ukrainian exposure, the brigade's analysis of the engineering work became intelligence for future engagement. The improved tracks were mapped. They were mined on the critical choke points at the tree line entry, and the mortar pre-registration database was updated to include the new routes. When the Russian armored push along those improved tracks eventually came, it encountered a defense that had been specifically adjusted to meet it. Ukrainian anti-tank guided missile teams, positioned in depth, engaged the lead vehicles before they reached the first choke point. The vehicles that avoided the initial engagement ran into the mined sections. Those that survived the mines were in a canalized corridor with forest on both sides and a pre-registered mortar grid waiting at the exit. Multiple pieces of open-source footage from this period show burning Russian armored vehicles on forest tracks in the Serebryanske area, BMP variants, at least one MTLB, and what appears to be a T-72 variant, all stopped in positions consistent with the canalization and ambush pattern described here. The Oryx open-source equipment loss database, which requires photographic confirmation for each entry, records confirmed losses of Russian armored vehicles in the Lyman-Kreminna sector that correlate with the periods of heaviest fighting in the forest tract. The financial math of this exchange is worth pausing on. A Russian BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle carries a replacement cost in the range of $1.5 to $2 million at pre-war production values. A Ukrainian Stugna P missile, with a range of over 5 kilometers and a tandem warhead capable of defeating modern reactive armor, costs somewhere in the range of $20,000 to $40,000 per round, depending on production run and configuration. The exchange ratio for a successful ambush engagement, even accounting for misses and the cost of position preparation, is wildly favorable to the defender. This is before accounting for the crew, the maintenance infrastructure, the training pipeline, and the command attention that goes into each destroyed vehicle. Multiply that exchange ratio across months of attritional forest fighting and the cumulative impact on Russian combat power in the sector becomes significant. Not decisive on its own, the Russian military can absorb equipment losses in ways that smaller militaries cannot, but significant in the context of an axis where Russian operational planners were attempting to build momentum toward Lyman, toward the rail network, toward the kind of operational level advance that would justify the costs being paid. That momentum never materialized. The Serebryanske sector remained contested. The forest remained in Ukrainian hands, and the Russian command kept paying the entry fee for assaults that did not achieve their objectives. Here is a question worth sitting with. Did the Russian command structure understand what it was dealing with? Did the officers ordering repeated assaults into this sector recognize that they were feeding troops into a prepared ambush belt, or did the combination of information control and command pressure suppress that recognition? The available open-source evidence suggests the answer is complicated. Russian milblog posts from the period, written by embedded reporters and unit commentators with military backgrounds, frequently described the Serebryanske fighting accurately in terms that acknowledged the prepared Ukrainian positions, the mine density, and the difficulty of conventional assault. These posts exist in the public record. They were being read by Russian military audiences, including, presumably, officers in the relevant chain of command. And yet the pattern of assault continued. What strikes me about this particular dynamic is what it reveals about the gap between information and decision in the Russian military system. The tactical level observers saw clearly what was happening. The information was available. The problem was that the institutional incentive structure, which rewarded forward movement and punished withdrawal in ways that the Soviet and post-Soviet officer corps had internalized over decades, created pressure to continue operations that the available evidence suggested were not working. Changing approach required admitting failure, and admitting failure in the Russian military context carries career consequences that officers consistently described as severe. This is not a story about brave Ukrainians and cowardly Russians. It is a story about institutional design. An army that punishes officers for accurate negative reporting will consistently receive inaccurate positive reporting, which means it will consistently make operational decisions based on a picture of reality that does not match the ground truth. The 80th did not need to defeat Russian tactical skill. They needed to defeat Russian institutional dysfunction. The forest gave them the conditions to do it. The 80th's rotation system deserves specific attention here because it addresses one of the fundamental problems of extended positional defense, the degradation of unit effectiveness over time. A unit that has been in contact for weeks is not the same unit it was when it arrived. Sleep deprivation, accumulated casualties, the psychological weight of sustained combat under mortar fire, these are attritional factors that operate independently of the enemy's direct actions. A defender who exhausts their own forces through overextension is ultimately doing the attacker's work for them. The brigade addressed this through a structured rotation of assault companies through the contested positions, maintaining continuous defensive pressure while ensuring that individual companies had rest periods to reconstitute, absorb replacements, and conduct the maintenance and resupply that sustained combat requires. Open-source reporting from Ukrainian journalists embedded with units in the sector and statements from Ukrainian military officials describing the operational approach in the Lyman-Kreminna area both reference a rotation system that kept the defensive belt manned by fresh enough forces without ever creating the gap that a Russian assault might exploit. This sounds simple in description. It is extremely difficult in practice. The logistics of rotating companies through a forest sector under observation and intermittent fire, maintaining the knowledge transfer between outgoing and incoming units about mine locations and reference points and local Russian approach patterns, managing the medical evacuation pipeline for the wounded, all of this requires staff work that is invisible in the combat footage and the unit-level narratives, but is absolutely foundational to the outcome. The 80th's ability to sustain this rotation over months of fighting reflects organizational capability that goes well beyond the individual bravery of its infantrymen. It also reflects something about Ukrainian military culture that has been consistently underestimated by outside observers. The degree to which the full-scale invasion drove rapid and genuine adaptation in how the Ukrainian military organized and executed at the operational level. The formations that fought in 2022 were learning in contact, adapting doctrine to reality at a rate that institutional militaries in peacetime conditions rarely achieve. By 2023, units like the 80th were operating with a level of small unit autonomy, reconnaissance integration, and terrain exploitation that reflected those hard-won lessons in ways that were not fully captured in any single doctrinal update or training program. Drone reconnaissance integration is a specific example worth examining. The Ukrainian military's adoption of commercially available drone platforms as organic reconnaissance assets, down to company and platoon level, is now widely documented. What is less often examined is how the integration of that reconnaissance asset specifically enabled the forest defense approach in the Serebryanske sector. The fundamental problem of defending a forest from a larger force is information. You need to know where the enemy is before they reach your position, because inside the forest, the ranges at which visual contact is made are extremely short. A Russian assault group that closes to within 50 meters of a Ukrainian position before being detected has a serious chance of overrunning it, regardless of the defender's skill and preparation, simply because there is not enough time and space to bring all the defensive systems to bear. Drone reconnaissance, operated by teams at company level, extended the 80th's detection horizon to several kilometers, well beyond visual range, beyond the range at which even acoustic cues were reliable. A Russian company forming up for an assault in a forest clearing 2 kilometers east of the Ukrainian position was visible to a drone operator long before it crossed the line of departure. That advance warning allowed the mortar section to prepare, the ATGM teams to orient toward the expected approach, and the ambush positions to stand to without the noise and activity that might compromise their locations. The drones were not always effective. Russian electronic warfare assets in the sector, particularly systems designed to jam the control frequencies of commercial drone platforms, created windows of blindness that the 80th had to plan around. There are documented instances in the open-source record of Ukrainian drone operations in this sector being disrupted by Russian EW, with operators losing control of platforms mid-mission. The response to this vulnerability was layering. Multiple drone platforms on offset frequencies, acoustic sensors for short-range detection when electronic assets were jammed, and human scouts positioned well forward to provide the reconnaissance that electronics could not when the jamming environment was severe. This is the obstacle pattern of the extended defense in microcosm. Every capability came with a vulnerability. Every advantage came with a Russian counter. And the 80th's sustained effectiveness required continuous adaptation to a threat environment that was itself changing. As Russian forces brought new EW assets to the sector, as Russian artillery technique evolved in response to Ukrainian counter-battery work, as Russian infantry learned some of the lessons from the costly assaults and began approaching differently. At no point was the Ukrainian defense static. It was a living system, continuously updated by the experience of contact. If you have followed the Russia-Ukraine conflict closely, you already understand why this sector mattered. But here is why this specific case, the 80th in Serebryanske, matters beyond the immediate tactical outcome. The Lyman-Kreminna axis represents one of the few places in the 2022-2024 period where Russian forces had a plausible operational level objective that would have produced strategic consequences if achieved. Kreminna sits on road and rail infrastructure that connects to the broader Donbass logistics network. A Russian penetration through the Serebryanske sector and beyond would have threatened Ukrainian positions further west and created pressure that could have forced a general withdrawal in the sector. The Russian command clearly understood this. The weight of effort directed at this axis and the repeated premium placed on movement reflected an operational intent that went beyond local territorial gain. The 80th's defense, alongside other Ukrainian units operating in the broader sector, denied that operational level objective month after month. The cumulative effect of the attritional exchange in the forest was not just the destruction of Russian equipment and the degradation of Russian unit cohesion. It was the freezing of Russian operational momentum on an axis that the Russian command needed to move. By the time the broader strategic situation in Ukraine shifted through 2024, with Russian forces redirecting significant combat power toward other axes, the Serebryanske sector had absorbed a Russian effort that failed to achieve its objectives despite sustained pressure over an extended period. The forest the Russian command had declared, cleared multiple times, remained contested, with Ukrainian forces maintaining positions throughout. Has similar terrain exploitation doctrine appeared anywhere else in the conflict? Yes, and the comparison is instructive. Ukrainian defensive operations in the Kherson bridgehead area, on the islands and in the reed beds of the Dnipro Delta, showed similar principles adapted to different terrain. The Azovstal defense in Mariupol in the spring of 2022 showed urban industrial terrain being used in analogous ways. Complex, three-dimensional ground converted into a prepared defensive system that imposed disproportionate costs on the attacker. The thread running through all these cases is the same: intelligent use of terrain to neutralize the attacker's advantages, forcing them to fight in conditions where their mass and firepower cannot be brought to bear effectively. There is a historical resonance here that military historians have noted. The Winter War of 1939-1940, in which Finnish forces used exactly this kind of forest ambush doctrine to savage Soviet forces operating in the Karelian wilderness, established the doctrinal playbook that the 80th was, consciously or not, working from. The Soviet military studied those Finnish lessons intensively after 1940 and wrote them into doctrine. Those doctrinal texts became part of the Ukrainian military inheritance after 1991, and in the Serebryanske forest in 2022 and 2023, Ukrainian officers were applying that inheritance against a Russian military that had, somewhere in the institutional memory loss of the post-Soviet decades, lost its grip on what that doctrine actually demanded. Will Russia draw the right lessons from this? Drop a comment with yes or no, because the answer shapes everything that comes next in the northern Donetsk sector. There are three questions this case raises that have implications well beyond the specific fighting in Serebryanske, and they are worth sitting with as we close. The first, could Russia have prevented this outcome? Probably yes, but only with capabilities and institutional behaviors that Russian forces in this sector demonstrably did not have. Proper deliberate forest clearance, with patient reconnaissance, systematic mine clearance using dedicated engineer assets, the suppression of Ukrainian drone operations before advancing, and the willingness to slow down to the pace the terrain demanded, would have been more effective than the repeated probing assaults that characterize the actual Russian approach. The Russian military has doctrine for this. The gap was between the doctrine on paper and the command culture that determined how operations were actually conducted. The second, what does the 80th's approach tell us about the future of forest and complex terrain defense in a world where cheap drone reconnaissance is widely available? The answer suggests that the historically observed attacker's advantage in force concentration, mass your forces, achieve local superiority, push through, is significantly degraded when the defender can detect that concentration at sufficient range to prepare. The Serebryanske experience is an early data point in what is likely to be a broader renegotiation of attacker-defender dynamics in complex terrain environments, and NATO planners with forests in their defensive thinking should be studying it carefully. The third, what was the 80th's actual ceiling? The brigade demonstrated what prepared, intelligent, well-led infantry can do in favorable terrain against a larger but institutionally dysfunctional opponent. The question of what their limits would have looked like against a more methodical attacker, one willing to accept slower progress in exchange for lower casualties and more systematic terrain clearance, is unanswered by the Serebryanske case. It is a question that matters for Ukrainian defensive planning on every axis going forward. The mud, the birch ridge, the pre-registered mortar grids, the drone operators watching Russian companies form up 2 kilometers out, these are the granular realities behind the map colors that shift incrementally on the daily situation updates. They represent months of work, thousands of individual decisions at the section and platoon level, and a sustained institutional effort to be smarter and faster and more locally capable than an opponent with more of almost everything else. Berkut never took the forest for granted. That is perhaps the simplest summary of why the 80th held it. If this kind of detailed OSINT breakdown is what you follow the conflict for, subscribe to Frontline Truth UA. We publish weekly investigations into the tactics, terrain, and systems that are actually determining outcomes in this war. The next episode examines the Ukrainian drone interdiction campaign against Russian logistics in the Zaporizhzhia sector, and how a single pattern recognition breakthrough by an open-source analyst changed the targeting picture for 2 months.